This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Okay, my name is Julia Teebken. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Free University Berlin at the Political and Social Sciences Department, and there I'm affiliated with two different institutes. One is the Graduate School of East Asian Studies, so I have a focus on East Asia, and the other one is the Environmental Policy Institute, so I have a focus on environmental policy. I graduated in 2015 from American University in Washington, D.C. With a program called Ethics, Peace and Global Affairs. So I developed concentration on environmental ethics, political philosophy. And before that I did a BA degree at the Free University in Berlin as well in sinology, so China studies with a minor in political science. So far I have mainly worked in academia, and I hope to be finishing my PhD next year in September, October, something like that. So I come from a very different angle, which is not, I'm not a legal scholar. So my field very much is political science. And in that context, I've looked at vulnerability from a very different standpoint, which is climate vulnerability and social vulnerability. So the assessments that I've used for my case selection for my PhD assume a very differential understanding of human vulnerability to climate impacts. And that has been my focus. And recently I've been studying to criticize that approach by using vulnerability theory as developed by Martha Feynman. So I have used it as a tool in order to criticize my current framework and very much the prevailing notion of differential vulnerability in environmental policy making and assessments related to climate change adaptation. So in that context, I have been increasingly looking at the social institutions that underlie why certain populations are more exposed than others to react and cope with stresses related to, for example, urban flooding, heat events, droughts, etc. So in that regard, I have changed my framework from looking at differential to human and institutional vulnerability. Okay, so I'm currently looking at two cases. One is Fulton County here in Atlanta, or Atlanta in Fulton County, and Jinhua County in Zhejiang, Eastern Chinese province. And so far, talking of best practices, we would first need to define what we mean by that. And since I'm very much interested in the social institutions, norms, values related to political decision-making processes, when looking at exposed populations, I haven't found any of these so-called best practices. So it would be very context-specific. There is no clear line of what constitutes a best practice because of the highly context-specific exposure of groups to climate impacts. And right now it's looking pretty doomed with regard to the way political priorities are being set and who is responsible for taking care, what's the function of government. So that's very much what I'm looking at. And the way our different political systems work doesn't very much look into success or failure, but what are the options available? In that context, what is political leadership? How are priorities being set? Keeping in mind that climate adaptation is a wicked policy challenge. So I'm still working on what would be an ideal, a more idealized form of best practices, but I haven't defined that yet. Yes, very much. So right now I'm arguing against the recognition of differential vulnerability, but instead look at the political institutions and values in decision making in the political context. And through that I hope to engage a more critical sense of responsibility of political actors related to the exposure, very disproportionate exposure of different groups. So in that regard, vulnerability theory has not just informed my framework, but also critically readjusted the literature that I'm looking at. So I'm now revising the way climate vulnerability assessments are being operated, how social vulnerability assessments maybe could be changed in the future in order to have a greater focus on institutions that construct resilience or that are more responsible for resulting in community resilience. Yeah, that's very much what my whole PhD endeavor is, right? So I'm looking at values, and this is a very abstract topic. And as I said, I'm not a legal scholar, but more from the political science field. So ultimately what this PhD my dissertation hopes to formulate is policy recommendations on how do we have to approach the issue of climate adaptation in the future, and I'm very much interested in the issue of just climate adaptation. So what constitutes that? And certainly it's more responsive social institutions. And in the Chinese context, the question has been more and more interesting is how do we overcome this feeling of indifference? How do we engage populations? Social education is a big key point, so I hope to tie in those recommendations into my research in the end. So I know what I have already taken away is a very great network of visiting scholars, faculty, friends that I gained during my time here. I made a lot of interesting connections in the political sphere. I cross-linked with some other departments at Emory, like the School of Public Health and the environment here at Emory. Certainly, I have really enjoyed Atlanta, and yeah, theory. I mean, I'm now theory expanding or readjusting my own framework. So all in all, it has been a very fruitful time, and I hope to come back early next year.